What's up, y'all? Welcome back to Bass Fishing Declassified. In this video, I want to talk about my favorite jig fishing modifications for fall bass fishing. Let's get into it. The fall is my favorite time to fish a jig, and because the conditions are changing so much from early fall to basically early winter, I will adjust my jig a lot throughout this fall period to match the lake conditions and the scenarios I'm finding myself in. So I wanted to go through all of those with you in this video so you're prepared for fall fishing. It's a little bit delayed this year. It's still pretty warm out here in Arkansas, but we're going to be getting some cold weather here soon, so these modifications should come in handy. This is the jig I'm actually throwing right now. I had on the lake today. That's my Fish to Moment offshore jig, and this is just a jig I made for Jewel and helped them design. It's basically a football jig with a double cable guard weed guard that comes through brush super well. I'll link them down in the description. It's a really good jig, and I'm pairing that up with the Big Bite Baits College Craw. This is kind of my in-between trailer when I am transitioning from the late summer period to those colder winter months. And I'll kind of explain all the trailers and everything I'm doing with these jigs. And let's kind of start with the trailers because those are a lot of times the easiest thing to talk about. As far as the three trailers I use, I basically throw the Strike King Menace Grub, the Big Bite Baits College Craw, and then the Yamamoto Fling Hog. So these are the three trailers I use. As far as the Menace Grub goes, the Menace Grub has a really aggressive action to it, and it's a lot better in my opinion in warmer water temperatures, when the water temperatures are above 75 degrees. You can see that this bait has a lot of movement in that tail, and whenever the water temperatures are above 75 degrees, I like to throw that Menace Grub when I'm fishing in clear water. I will go to a Striking Rage Craw if I'm fishing in dirtier water in the summertime as well for even more action, but that Menace Grub is a great trailer when, again, water temps are 75 or above. But once those water temperatures get a little bit colder than that, I would say anywhere from about the 60 degree range to the 75 degree range, I want a trailer with just a little bit less action, and that's when I go to that Big Bite Baits College Craw. This bait has longer appendages, so you think it might even have more action, but it doesn't have these little flanges on the bottom that catch water and kick a bunch. Instead, it kind of has these flat flappers, I guess is what you call them, or pincers, and it causes the bait to glide a little bit more, though it does have some action to it. And it's kind of an intermediary between the three trailers I throw. And so whenever I'm trying to target 60 to 75 degree water temperatures, I'm going with that Big Bite Baits College Craw or a craw that's similar, like a Berkeley Chigger Craw or other types of kind of just straight, flat paddle tail trailers on the back. I'm usually using a green pumpkin-esque jig. This is more of like a watermelon candy jig, though I do like to throw PB&J as well. I'm actually all picky about my jig colors. Mainly I just like to have a green pumpkin trailer on the back and then just pick whatever jig color I grab out of the box between PB&J and this watermelon candy. So those are my kind of first two jig trailers, but then the third jig trailer is this Yamamoto Fling Hog. So this is a lot beefier trailer that has these little arms and appendages, and again these straight flapping legs. The thing about that Fling Hog though is that it has a nice wide body to it, and that's going to slow the fall of this jig considerably. This is a 5/8 ounce jig, and I will throw this 5/8 ounce Fish to the Moment offshore jig in anywhere from, let's say, I don't know, 30 feet of water at the beginning of the fall, maybe even 40 feet of water, up to 5 feet of water later in the fall. But usually I find that I'm fishing a little bit shallower as it gets colder, which seems semi-counterintuitive, but in general I'll be fishing this jig again in that 30 to 40 foot range a lot in September, which is one of the benefits of having a bait or a trailer like that College Craw, because it doesn't have that much water resistance and it lets it fall down that deep water really well. But that Yamamoto Fling Hog is going to slow the fall of this bait down by probably like a half a foot per second, which is crazy. You wouldn't think it makes that big of a difference, but it really does. And that's going to be great when these fish are more lethargic and water temperatures are below 60 degrees. So when the water temps are below 60 degrees, fish are busting over here. The water temperature is below 60 degrees. I'm gonna be throwing this Yamamoto flapping hog to slow the fall of that jig down rather than decreasing the weight of my jig. I like to have a 5/8 ounce jig on because it really allows you to feel the cover down there really well and feel the bottom contact. And so rather than going down to like a 3/8 ounce jig, which is harder to feel, I will just go to a trailer that's going to slow that fall rate down. And I find I get bigger bites and I have a lot better feel when I use that setup. I'll do the exact same thing on a flipping jig. This is the Motion Fishing brush flipping jig. It's my favorite flipping jig. It has a hand-tied skirt, which is great for skipping baits and things like that around. It has a nice weed guard and a really nice flipping hook. And I will do the exact same approach with this Motion Fishing flipping jig. I'm gonna use that menace grub. Water temperatures are above 75 degrees. I'll go to the college craw when the water temperatures are 60 to 75 degrees. And I'll go to that flapping hog when the water temperatures are below 60 degrees for the exact same reasons. It's just a flipping jig, which I'm flipping up in shallower water. Now I'm also going to make some modifications to my jig itself when I'm fishing in the different times of the fall. So as you can see with my Fish the Moment offshore jig, it comes with a really long skirt. A lot of anglers wonder why I do that, and the reason we designed it that way is just because in the summer, a lot of times I like to put even like a big straight tail worm on the back of these jigs and different kind of funky things. And having that longer skirt is something that these fish are just not used to seeing. And so in a lot of situations, you can actually catch a lot of really good fish on a big long skirt like that. But in the fall, I'm not using that big skirt. This is something I really use mainly in the post-spawn time of the year and in the kind of early to mid-summer. So again, the reasons for potentially changing up my jig for the fall is that I want to fish deeper and I also want to adjust for the water temperatures. So first up in the early fall, I just want to get that bait down to 30 or 40 feet of water as quick as possible. So the way I'm going to do that is trim up my jig, and I'm going to basically come in here and I am going to cut off my jig skirt, not all the way down to where the hook bend is, but probably about like ½ an inch from that hook bend. I'm going to cut that just like that right there. Got one extra strand right there. So that's going to give me a pretty short skirt, especially compared to what we started with, but it still has enough fullness to it that when those fish are trying to eat it, they're more aggressive in that late summertime, early fall. They still have a nice big meal to eat. And I'll just pair that up with that menace grub trailer, and that fits on there really well. You can kind of see the length of that works out really well. Now, that works again, water temperatures are above 75 degrees. But once we hit 75 degrees to like 60 degree water temperature, I'm actually going to trim that skirt a little bit differently. But I'll actually use this exact same jig skirt trimming when the water temperatures are below 60 degrees. So it seems a little bit strange, but hear me out. I like to use the same jig skirt trimming style when the water temperatures are 60 degrees or below with that flapping hog to really slow down that jig. The more the skirt material is on there, more skirt material you have on there, the slower that jig is going to fall. And a lot of times in that sub 60 degree water temperature range, the fish are going to be very lethargic and they're just going to want one good meal. They don't necessarily want to be eating a ton of bait fish or shad or anything like that. So when they're going after one big meal, a little bit longer skirt that's a little bit fuller with that bigger flapping hog that slows the bait down is going to give them a slow moving big meal that they can eat and sustain themselves for an entire day. And that's why I go with this jig trimming setup. The only thing I'm going to change up between that summer and winter time when the water temperature is between 60 and 75 degrees is to actually trim the skirt up even more. And I'm going to do two things. One, I'm going to come in here and I'm going to trim, actually I'm going to do it to my jig I have on my rod because I actually haven't, you can see I have it still trimmed for my earlier in the year. It's still kind of warm, but water temperatures are just like 76 degrees, but it's going to get cold next week, so I might as well trim up the jig I'm throwing. So this is going to be a modified jig specifically for my next fishing trip, so you know it's actually what I'm doing. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to come in here and I'm going to trim that skirt even a little bit more. I'm going to come within a ¼ inch right there of the hook bend. So of that hook bend, I'm going to come a ¼ inch, and I'm also going to come in here and I'm going to start pulling out a few strands of that skirt and breaking them in half. So I'm going to break that jig skirt in half, and I'm going to pull the lower half. The way this Fish Moment offshore jig comes standard, you can see we already have some shorter strands that are in there that's kind of like a finesse jig style. If I was trimming up another jig, which I'll show you in a second, I'll actually trim it to a finesse skirt. But because we already have that, I'm going to come in here and I'm going to grab just a few strands, and I'm going to clip those in half just with my hand. Don't do it all in the same spot in the jig, because it will kind of throw off the balance of the jig. But I like to just grab a few strands and break them off halfway on the lower part. And this is going to do two things. It's going to thin out that skirt, which makes this bait look a little bit less imposing. And when these fish are in that like kind of 60 to 75 degree water temperature range, a lot of times you'll have the fall turnover, and these fish are going to be feeding on smaller forage, whether that's smaller bait fish as well as smaller crawfish. And then as you get later in the year, they're going to want to start feeding on bigger forage. So as you can see, I have basically pulled some of those skirts. I can probably pull a few more even, and just keep ripping some of those out. Now I have more of a puffed out skirt compared to what we had earlier. It's not a huge difference, but you can kind of see it's a little bit shorter, and the way that that jig sits, it actually puffs out a little bit more. It actually flares out more. So that's the jig skirt setup I use when I get into the kind of 60 to 70 degree range, 75 degree range. So I'll rig up that college crawl back on there, and we are now set to go. So that's my jig I'm gonna be throwing here all the way up until that water temperature hits 60 degrees. They're literally busting on the bank over here, guys. I should be fishing with these conditions, but I'm over here making videos. Anyways, no worries. But that is a sweet little jig for the offshore jig, the Fish Moment offshore jig. But if you wanted to use a flipping jig, you can kind of do the same thing. Again, this jig actually is great because it comes pre-trimmed to the right length I like it, which is just about, it's a little bit long, but I actually like that. It's just, the hook is not as long on this, it's a shorter shank hook. So it's about an inch from that hook bend, but that's not bad because again, it's a little bit shorter hook than that Fish Moment offshore jig. But then if I am getting into the 60 to 75 degree range, I'm gonna trim this jig up quite a bit compared to what we have here. This is what I'll throw late summer, 75 degree water temperatures and above, or below 60 degrees. But if it's in that 60 to 75 degree range, what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to split this skirt, and I'll try to do this here on camera quickly. So I'm going to try to split that skirt. Didn't do a bad job there. You can see it's a hand-tied skirt there, and I'm going to basically get it so that all of the lower half of the skirt is down below, and then the upper half is hanging upside down. So I've split that skirt in two. Now I'm going to come in here with my scissors, and I'm going to trim basically half of that skirting material off. I don't want to trim the entire thing off. I want to trim half of that skirting material off. And that's going to give you a very floppy look to that jig. And then I'm also going to trim a little bit off the bottom, just so we have a ½ inch, just like that. That's going to be how I rig that. Now you can see we have a smaller, more compact jig, but it also flares out like crazy and has a little bit more action. And I feel like a lot of times when those fish are aggressive in that 60 to 75 degree water temperature range, they love this way I trim it, and it just looks different from what other anglers are using. So I'll put that college crawl in the back, and I'll just go right there with that jig setup. That looks so good. I want to go flip a jig right now. I think it's a little bit too warm still for me to go flipping a jig on this lake. But anyways, I love the way that skirt looks. It flares out, and that's a great little modification on that jig. That's how I always run this jig, 60 to 75 degree water temperatures. I know it seems kind of picky on the water temperature ranges and stuff, but trust me guys, I've thrown jigs for thousands of hours in the fall, literally thousands of hours. And I do believe these modifications make a difference. I have just tried pretty much everything over the last 15 years on jigs, and I've just come to find that this gets me the most bites. I find that I can catch fish behind other anglers as well when I was tournament fishing with these small modifications, and I do think it does make a difference. Not going to change getting 20 bites a day or 0 bites a day, but it'll definitely help you put 3 or 4 extra fish in the boat if you get on a good jig pattern. So definitely try all these modifications out. If you're looking for a good jig setup in terms of your equipment, the rod and reel I always use, I use the same rod and line and everything for both the flipping jig and the football jig. I'll just cut the football jig off and put the flipping jig on if I'm gonna go flip. And that's the Denali Lithium Pro 7.4 heavy power fast action worm and jig rod. I'm pairing that with 20-pound fluorocarbon line and just an Abu Garcia Max Pro reel. This reel actually works pretty well for skipping. It's a little bit more expensive than all the Black Maxes I run, but I find that it does get the job done when skipping around shallow, so I do like that. 20-pound line is usually good most of the time. I will go down to 16-pound line if I'm fishing really, really deep with my football jigs in like 30, 40 foot of water, sometimes even down to 14-pound test, and I will have a second jig rod. I actually have one in here that has 14-pound line if I am fishing a jig super deep. But in general, I can get away with 20-pound test in most situations with both the football and the flipping jig. So that's kind of my setup there. That's how I modify those jigs. And hopefully that'll give you some good ways to adjust your jigs to match the conditions this fall and put a lot more fish in the boat. If you enjoyed these tips, make sure you subscribe down below to the Bass Fishing Declassified YouTube channel. I left a link to all these baits down in the description, so make sure you check out those links and click on those so I get a small percentage of the profits through Tackle Warehouse. Really appreciate that. And other than that, we'll see you guys in the next video.